The last time he slapped me, I tasted pennies and carpet burn at the same time. His hand had come fast like it always did over the table, across the soup, across the mashed potatoes, into the side of my cheek like I was nothing. My head snapped sideways, hit the edge of the chair, and dropped to the carpet. The chicken bones on his plate hadn't moved. Our mother didn't flinch. She kept eating. That was a Sunday. I remember the color of her shirt. Yellow. I bled onto her hem as she stepped over me to get more gravy. He told me to stop crying like a baby as I swallowed a tooth. That tooth would later sit in my jewelry box for 17 years. I didn't cry after that. He noticed, but not in the way people notice growth. It irritated him. I started to learn that silence made him more violent, but also more confused. That confusion was the only power I had. The smell of gravy triggers me, thick and cheap. I used to gag at it, and he would smack the back of my head with a spoon, laughing when I choked. He always said he was just knocking some sense into me. But it wasn't sense he knocked in. It was fire that settled behind my eyes and never left. That night I slept in the bathtub with a towel wrapped around my bleeding ear. He banged on the door, once laughed and left. My mother never asked. My father had died when I was 6. I used to imagine him sitting with me in that tub telling me it would be over soon. It wasn't soon. Years later, I'd sit in a high-rise office in downtown Seattle, staring out at the sound, holding the power to freeze every cent in my brother's life. But back then, I was 10. I only held a towel and silence. I remember his voice from that night like it's still taped to the back of my skull. Slurred from beer, cocky, older brother, cruel. You're lucky I even let you eat at the table. I learned to be silent from the first blow. I was 9. He was 15. I was peeling glue off my fingers at the kitchen table, humming something from a cartoon. He was on the phone, bragging like always about a fight he nearly started at school. His voice filled the whole house, even though he was just one body. My laugh, small too light, must have cut across his ego like glass. Without even looking, he slapped the back of my head. Hard, the kind of hard that makes your vision swim. My teeth clicked together, and for a moment I thought I'd swallowed a molar. I remember the silence after more than the sound itself. My humming stopped. So did the glue. The phone call didn't. He didn't even pause. Just kept talking like nothing happened, like the noise of me getting hit was no more significant than a car driving by outside. I didn't cry. Not because I was brave. I didn't cry because I didn't know if I was allowed to. That night I asked my mom if she had any ice. She looked at the red mark across my cheek like it was spaghetti sauce, said nothing, just handed me a bag of frozen peas and turned back to her show. I slept on the floor that night, not because I had to, but because I didn't want him to know how scared I was. I thought if I stayed still and quiet, I could undo it, make it go away. He hit me again 3 days later, then again the next week, and then more regularly than my own birthday. Always fast, always with something his hand, a spoon, a book, a belt once. He liked how little sound I made, said it meant I was learning. I remember the first time I looked at him and felt something deeper than fear. It wasn't hate, not yet. It was a question, why does no one stop you? I asked that question in my head over and over again until it burned hotter than the bruises. I began counting his footsteps, memorizing the pattern of his anger. He always hit me when he was bored, or hungry, or if his team lost, or if I existed too loudly. He was creative about his reasons, less creative about his methods. I wasn't just a little sister to him. I was a living, breathing thing to blame. A soundboard for his failures, a punching bag for his manhood, a placeholder for his rage. But even back then I watched. I remembered. I was always quiet but never empty. I left. No one asked why. I was 15 and had just learned how to fake a signature well enough to write my own permission slips. My backpack wasn't full of books. It was full of cash I'd stolen from his room clothes, rolled tight, and a burner phone bought at a gas station 3 towns over. The night before I left, he'd shoved me so hard against the fridge that the handle left a bruise down my spine, all because I didn't get his soda fast enough. My mother didn't say a word. She never did. She just turned up the volume on her game show and smoked out the kitchen window like the smell of cigarettes could cover the rot in our house. He was 21 by then, living at home working part-time for our uncle's auto shop and acting like a god because he could fix a carburetor. He wore his confidence like a badge, tight, shiny, and reeking of entitlement. My mother called him her only son, even though I was right there. Her only son, like I was a rumor. That last night I didn't cry. I'd outgrown tears the same way I'd outgrown toys suddenly and without ceremony. I waited until they were both asleep, crept out the back door, and left my keys on the stoop like an offering. No one came looking, not even once. I stayed on a friend's couch, then a youth shelter, then foster care for a few months until I aged out and disappeared into a city that didn't know my name. It was easier than I thought it would be to become invisible. I didn't go back for holidays. I didn't send postcards. I didn't respond to the single text my mother sent 2 years later. Your brother's looking for you. Come home. I blocked her number. I got my GED, then a scholarship, then an internship, then a job in finance. I was quiet, precise, unnoticed, everything corporate systems love in a woman. They called me meticulous, disciplined, sharp. I smiled through performance reviews and let the praise hit the outside of my skin like rain on a rooftop. Inside, I was still sitting at that kitchen table, blood in my mouth, eyes on the edge of a soup bowl, memorizing every insult he'd ever thrown like it was gospel. People asked why I never talked about my family. I always smiled and said it's a long story. It wasn't long, it was just too cold to tell out loud. He was the golden boy with a rusted heart. My brother Trevor was the kind of son small towns loved. Quarterback, auto shop prodigy. Smiled with his mouth but never his eyes. When Dad died, he was 12 and already too big for sympathy. People brought casseroles and said things like, "He's the man of the house now." He believed them. I was 6. My grief came out in drawings, in nightmares, in hiding under tables during thunderstorms. My mom used to sigh when I cried, said I don't have time for another broken thing. Trevor became the center, not just of our house, but of everything. The school gave him awards, our uncle gave him a job, my mother gave him money she didn't have, and when he started hurting me, no one gave a damn. He hit me with everything: fists, elbows, his words. But it was his money that made the bruises invisible. Once I tried to tell a school counselor. I remember her perfume-sweet, cloying fake vanilla. I said, "My brother hurts me." She tilted her head and said, "Boy's roughhouse. Maybe don't provoke him." I never spoke of it again. My mother once caught him slamming my wrist in a drawer. I looked up at her tears clinging to my lashes, my lips sealed out of habit. She looked away. She told me later, "Don't make him angry. You know how he is." They called it just his temper. I called it terrorism. He got a used car at 17. I got a used textbook and a lock on my bedroom door. He was always dressed in confidence, always going somewhere. When he got arrested for drunk driving at 19, my mother drained her savings to pay his lawyer. She said, "Boys make mistakes. He's got potential." I remember thinking, what do I have? Nothing. No one came to my school events. No one noticed when I went a week without speaking. I became fluent in erasure. I learned to shrink myself until I fit inside silence. Trevor once said, "You were always jealous of me." I laughed, quietly, because envy was the one thing I had no room for. What would I envy? His praise, his power, his freedom to hurt? Maybe. But even then, some part of me knew. I wasn't jealous. I was patient. Because eventually everything rots. And I would be the one to sweep his bones off the table. I survived by turning myself into glass. Not invisible, just sharp, clear, and easy to look through. I learned how to walk without sound, how to leave a room before he could notice I was in it. My body was a map of careful movements. Every door creaked in our house. I knew which floorboards moaned. I memorized the rhythm of his boots on the stairs like a song I never wanted to hear again. Every bruise had a story, but I stopped telling them even to myself. They didn't fade, they relocated, from skin to memory, from muscle to marrow, from pain to calculation. I mastered how to keep my arms covered in summer, how to fake allergies so people wouldn't question swollen eyes, how to laugh without showing teeth. Once he broke my glasses with the heel of his palm. I wore them cracked for 2 weeks before anyone said anything. Even then, my teacher just gave me a note to take home. My mother signed it with her eyes on a magazine. By 14, I could predict his moods with deadly accuracy. If the Seahawks lost, I stayed in the laundry room. If his paycheck bounced, I didn't ask for dinner. If I smiled too long, he'd accuse me of mocking him. If I cried, he'd smile. He only smiled when I cried. I developed what I now call weaponized silence. It wasn't compliance, it was strategy. I stopped reacting. I stopped defending myself. My detachment made him uneasy. Sometimes he'd whisper after hitting me, "You think you're better than me." I never answered. That was my answer. I became obsessed with numbers, not out of interest but survival. I tracked dates, slaps, hours between eruptions. It gave me a sense of control. If I could predict it, maybe I could outlast it. Math became a sanctuary. Patterns were safer than people. He flunked algebra. I aced calculus in secret. He said I was weirdly quiet. My mother said I was just not social. My teachers said I was promising but distracted. No one said the word abuse, not once. One night after a particularly bad beating, I stared at the bathroom mirror and practiced smiling, not out of vanity, out of rehearsal. I knew one day I'd leave, and when I did, I wanted to know how to wear normal like a dress I'd grown into. I wanted to be able to look him in the eye years from now and smile like the pain had never touched me. Like I'd won. But first I had to live long enough to get away. The most damage he ever did didn't leave a mark. It was 2 weeks before I turned 15. He'd stopped using his hands so much he didn't need to. By then, his words cut deeper than anything physical. That night, he came home drunk something cheap on his breath, some lie in his eyes. I was sitting on the couch doing math homework. He pulled the pages from my lap, stared at them like they were written in fire, and said, "You think that's gonna save you, that some dumb numbers mean you're smarter than me." I didn't answer. I never did. He laughed low cruel and bent down face to face. His voice was almost gentle. "You'll never get out of this house. You're nothing without us. You think colleges want some freak with a dead dad and a limp-wristed GPA." He stood up and crumpled my homework into his fist. Then he did something I never forgot. He looked at me and said, "You'll die in this house just like Mom will, with nothing, because you are nothing." That was the moment something snapped. Not loudly, not like a scream, more like a quiet final breath. Something inside me shriveled into steel, the kind of steel that doesn't shine, just holds, cold and unbending. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, listening to the fridge hum, staring at the checkbook my mother always left next to the coffee pot. I opened it. I didn't know why at first, maybe to prove to myself there was something to leave behind. But when I did, I saw his name written across half the ledger. Withdrawals, loans, debt, his hand all over her money, her silence in every missing dollar. That was the real violence. He owned her. And he thought he owned me too. I traced the pages, touching every torn-out stub. I stared at the account numbers. I didn't know it yet, but that moment would be the seed of my revenge. He never laid a finger on me again after that. He didn't have to. His words had done what his fists never could, make me doubt whether I was real, whether I mattered. But that night I wrote something in my notebook, not a math problem. I wrote survive now, destroy later. It became a vow. He went back to sleep in his room, snoring like a king who thought his castle was safe. And I sat there, hands shaking, eyes dry, looking at his name in that checkbook like it was a target. He broke me, but in doing so, he showed me where he kept his own cracks. I would remember. I would wait. I disappeared like dust from a dirty table, quiet final unnoticed. No slamming doors, no teary goodbyes, no note. It was spring, cold enough at night to see your breath. I slipped out wearing 2 sweaters and carrying everything I owned in a plastic bag from the drugstore. It had rained earlier and my shoes soaked through before I reached the bus stop. I didn't care. Wet feet were better than broken ribs. I still remember the sound of the city swallowing me, The way everything hummed with movement and indifference, it felt like freedom. I'd spent 3 weeks planning it. Every penny I'd stolen from his wallet counted, every small lie rehearsed. I used my library card to apply for state programs, found shelter food banks, free clinics. There were no rescue missions, no guardian angels, just me, my numbers, and the raw need to be gone. He didn't try to find me, he didn't even report me missing. That told me everything I needed to know about my place in that house. By 17, I was renting a room in someone's basement and working night shifts. By 18, I had 2 jobs and a prepaid cell. I didn't have friends, I didn't go to parties, I didn't date. Love to me looked like a fist midair. I wasn't interested. What I had was time, and memory, and a growing skill in finance. Numbers made sense. They weren't cruel, they weren't loud. They either balanced or they didn't. I liked that. I kept my head down through community college, working extra hours, building credits, building credit. Every bank I passed made me feel something strange and warm, like one day I'd own the power they handed out to men like him without question. I avoided social media, changed my last name, deleted every trace of the girl who lived in that yellow house with rotting walls. She wasn't gone, just shelved, like a file I'd revisit when I was ready to reopen the case. I thought I'd feel relief, but what I felt was silence. Not the kind that protects, but the kind that echoes. I didn't cry on my birthdays. I didn't light candles. I didn't look back. But I never stopped seeing his face behind my eyelids when I slept. I dreamed of him yelling, of me shrinking, of soup bowls and broken pens and fists that never stopped coming. But eventually the dreams began to change. In one, I sat across from him in a glass office, my nails manicured, my hair tied up, and a single signature in front of me. He looked confused, small. I liked that one. That's the one I started chasing. I came back colder than the city I left. Seattle looked different through tinted car windows and expensive glasses. I had money now, not flashy, just clean, quiet. Money that didn't smell like desperation or come with conditions. Money that let me move without flinching. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back. I booked a short-term rental in a building with concierge service and soundproof walls. I bought furniture, online scheduled delivery, and paid in full. I had a view of the harbor, a full fridge, and a drawer full of unmailed letters I'd written to a girl who never got to speak. And then one day I saw him, outside a payday loan shop, wearing the same smirk but heavier. His belly stuck out over jeans that had lost their shape. He walked like a man with bad knees and worse habits. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was taller, sharper. My hair was sleek, my face framed with makeup that didn't say pretty, it said untouchable. I had a walk that said I owned the ground, not borrowed it. I followed him for weeks, not close, just enough. I learned everything. Where he worked assistant manager at a struggling tire store, where he drank cheap bars with sticky floors, who he talked to mostly himself. He lived in a crumbling rental house with a girlfriend who looked as tired as my mother used to. She worked double shifts, he barely worked one. He was drowning, he just didn't know the tide would be mine. I got close without touching him. I applied for a job at the credit union where he had his checking account. Got it. I didn't even need it. My consulting firm paid triple, but I wanted the inside. I wanted the keys. I wanted access. He came in the second week I was there, looked me dead in the face, hesitated, then smiled like he was about to hit on me. He asked if I was new. I said yes, voice even, heart steady. He flirted. I played along. That night I took the checkbook I had once stared at in the dark and drew a perfect line through his name mentally, of course. He gave me everything, his account number, his birthday, his mother's maiden name. I didn't even have to ask. He wanted a loan increase. I smiled. You'll hear back within a week. You will, but not the way you think. Everything was unfolding, beautifully, silently. I watched him walk out the door with that old arrogance in his step. And I thought, you have no idea who you just handed the knife to. He trusted me with the knife, and I carved him open in silence. I didn't swing hard. I didn't need to. 1,000 small cuts bleed just the same. First, I marked his credit card activity. Late payments, overdrawn fees, payday loans. I flagged them, quietly, an internal note here, a report filed there. He got warnings in the mail, standard impersonal cold. He ignored them. He always ignored the things that warned him. Then I denied his loan, politely of course, income too unstable, account behavior too erratic, standard rejection copy. I made sure it was worded just right to sting his pride but not raise suspicion. He came in yelling, said he knew people, said he'd been banking here for years. I apologized, calm, professional, policy is policy. He stormed out red-faced and sweating. I watched through the glass, one hand steady on my keyboard. My pulse never broke rhythm. Next step, his auto payments. I altered one digit in his routing number. Not enough to bounce every bill, just enough to trigger penalties. His car insurance lapsed. His internet froze. His cell phone bill doubled. He called the bank 6 times that month. He never once asked for me by name. The girl behind the counter with the perfect posture and tidy smile, she was no one to him. Another helper, another voice, another woman meant to fix his mess and vanish. I didn't vanish. I watched his credit score sink like a slow, drowning body. I sent him pre-approval letters for credit cards he'd never qualify for. I marked them urgent, red stamp, the kind of bait someone like him would always take. He did, applied, denied, again. His girlfriend left him that winter. I saw the withdrawal from the florist, $83.45, and then the return marked canceled. He didn't know where the leak was. He blamed the bank, then the economy, then the government. He never blamed me. And that was the beauty of it. I wasn't the sister he slapped at the dinner table anymore. I was the face behind the account freeze, the decline notices, the please contact customer service loops. I was the reason his debit card embarrassed him in front of cashiers. Eventually, he overdrew so far we had to close his account. I was the one who authorized the termination, clicked the button, confirmed the prompt, sent the final notice letter, folded, stamped, mailed. The envelope was the same size as the ones my mother used to pay his bail. Full circle. When he came in to plead, I happened to be on my break, watching from the hall. Watching him unravel in front of the branch manager, voice cracking, eyes wet. "I don't know what's happening," he said. I did. And I wasn't finished. The day I ended him was a Thursday. Crisp, overcast, the kind of cold that makes your bones remember who hurt them. I wore black slacks, a pressed blouse, and the smallest smile I've ever smiled. Not smug, not kind. Just done. He'd switched banks by then out of frustration, opened a new account. New beginnings, right? I was already there. As a consultant now, not a teller. A third-party risk analyst hired to review internal security issues. I'd worked years to earn that kind of access. Earned it in silence and sleepless nights, in rage repurposed into degrees and certifications. He had no idea I was inside the walls before he even walked through the door. The final stage was surgical. I found the hidden debts. The unpaid tickets, the bounced checks he forgot about. I pulled records from databases he didn't even know existed. I pieced together the story he was trying to hide with duct tape and denial, and then I reported him. Formally, quietly. Flagged for fraud. He showed up in a panic weeks later, sweating through a cheap jacket, yelling at the receptionist. His card didn't work. His paycheck never posted. His rent check bounced. Again. I need to speak to someone in charge. He said it loud, just like he always did when he was afraid. I stepped out from the back. He blinked, looked at me. His eyes twitched like they recognized something but couldn't place it. I said his name. He stared. "Do I know you?" I tilted my head. "No, but I know you." His mouth opened, then closed. His shoulders dropped like the truth had started to land one brick at a time. "I'm the one who froze your account," I said softly. "I'm the one who reported your name to the credit bureau. I'm the reason no bank wants you anymore." He took a step back. "You were right," I said. "I didn't get out. Not really. I just waited." His face crumpled. No tears. Just confusion, defeat. The kind of collapse that doesn't come with noise, just gravity. He started to speak. I raised one hand. "No," I said. "You don't talk now." He stood there half broken, surrounded by people watching a man fall apart. And I walked away. I didn't scream, I didn't hit, I didn't explain. I left him the way he used to leave me on the floor, looking up, wondering how someone so small could do so much damage. Somewhere in a drawer at home, I still keep that torn checkbook. The pages faded, the edges worn. It's not a trophy, it's a receipt. And I paid in full.